Well, good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to today's presentation to learn a little bit more about the Macrogrid initiative. And we're pleased to have with us today Tracy Warren, who is the Executive Director for the Macrogrid initiative. Tracy comes to this effort with more than 20 years of experience in the energy industry. And most recently, she served as the lead for external communications at the NRECA, the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association. For those of you who are attending in today's presentation, throughout the presentation, if you have any questions, there is the ability to submit them through the questions portion over on the right-hand side of your screen. Submit them at any point throughout the presentation. They will come to me, and I will work them in to Tracy's presentation or towards the end of the presentation, either way. So I would like to invite and in fact encourage you to submit questions so that we have the opportunity to engage with Tracy as we learn more about the Macrogrid initiative. So with that introduction, Tracy, I'd like to turn it over to you. And we're interested in hearing more about what's going on with the Macrogrid initiative.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Wires. I really appreciate the opportunity and your time today. Want to give a shout out. I think there are two co-ops who are participating in this webinar, Great River Energy and Sunflower. As you'll see from my presentation, I still have a soft spot for rural electrification and co-ops in my heart, even though I'm now with the Macrogrid initiative. And as you know, I'm here to talk about the Macrogrid initiative, but also to answer the question, can we still build big, beautiful things? And of course, I believe that the rural electrification and the national grid is a big, beautiful thing. So I'm going to start with my assumptions. First, yes, of course we can build big, beautiful things. We build wind farms. But specifically, I'm talking today about high voltage transmission lines, and even more specifically, I am talking about a macro grid. And I believe you've had Aaron Bloom has spoken to this group before, so you're probably familiar with the concept of a macro grid, but this is a new initiative, the macro grid initiative. So my last assumption, and next slide, please. My last assumption is that we all agree that transmission is beautiful. This is the bold transmission towers. These were designed, I believe, by AEP employees. And I put this slide in here because, first of all, it was the second tweet I ever sent out from my Twitter account was a picture of these transmission towers. I just think they look so cool. But of course, all transmission is beautiful. We just need to convince everybody else that to see it the way we see it. Of course, if you don't agree that it's beautiful, you can put that challenge in the chat function and we can discuss. Next slide, please. So I also believe that the macro grid is a beautiful thing, and to prove that point, I've got this amazing graphic that was done by NREL, and again, I think you've seen this before from Aaron Bloom, but I think the major point that you can see from this visualization is that what we're talking about is a project that is truly continental in scope. It's and so de facto extremely ambitious. I just want to point out this is the point of this visualization is to show power moving from the eastern to the western regions, and so the circle on the right shows power moving both within regions and then also without regions, and then you can see again that exchange down in the graphic at the bottom. So this is this represents the possibilities that are available with the macro grid. As we all know, the bulk power system was built to move power from large hydro and coal-fired power plants and later nuclear plants to where it's needed. And stated most simply, the macrogrid reconfigures the system. It's a high voltage DC overlay on the grid to move large amounts of power from the areas rich in wind and solar resources to the places where that power is needed. Next slide, please. So another visualization, as you can see, I believe that pictures are one of the most compelling ways to get your point across. So this again, we are going to be talking to policymakers, and for policymakers, it's helpful to just show what we're talking about in that you can see here that the wind and solar resources are not located either within the electric grid regions or near the population centers. So just to back up a little bit, the Macrogrid Initiative is a partnership between Americans for a Clean Energy Grid. I know you're all familiar with that organization, and the American Council on Renewable Energy, and it's funded by Breakthrough Energy, which is from the Gates Foundation. It is founded on the growing recognition that the country needs to make significant investments in transmission if we're going to have an electric grid that meets our future needs. And Kathy Castor, Representative Kathy Castor, who is chair of the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, said it best: a modern economy needs a modern grid. The goals of the Macrogrid Initiative are to build public and policymaker support for an expanded national and eastern grid with a focus on the regions of MISO, PJM, and SPP. We are advocating for a fully planned and integrated interregional transmission system, and we're working with partners to enlist state leaders to advance the next round of regional and interregional transmission planning. So next slide, please. So as I said, we're talking to members of Congress, we're talking to policymakers, we're talking to a lot of people, and we are making the case for the macrogrid. A lot of what I'm going to say in this presentation is the message that we are taking to those stakeholders. Much of this it's not going to be new. In fact, most of it is not going to be new to you. And in fact, much of this is supported by research that WIRES has done. So I have found those reports extremely valuable as I've been educating myself, but also figuring out how to put these messages into compelling statements. So, but this is what you will see on our website. Expanded and upgraded interregional transmission lines would help utilities, corporate and institutional buyers, and other consumers meet carbon and clean energy goals by affordably and reliably integrating low-cost renewable resources. Enhanced transmission will also facilitate increased electrification and ensure grid reliability in the face of new patterns of electricity demand. It's a very tightly compacted statement, but that pretty much says what we believe. And to back that up, increased transmission development at the seams between regions could save consumers up to $47 billion annually and return more than $2.50 for every dollar invested. I think that there is, probably our most compelling statistic: $47 billion annually that will go to consumers. And we believe that a nationwide high voltage direct current network optimized for the nation's wind and solar resources could deliver 80% carbon reductions from the grid by 2030 without adding costs to consumers' electricity bills. So there you have it in a condensed form. That's what the Macrogrid Initiative is all about. put a different way, we need to expand and upgrade our transmission infrastructure in order to support electrification, increase reliability, save consumers money, create jobs, help states and utilities meet their emission reductions goals. This is, as I said, our message to policymakers, including our members of Congress. But this is also the same message we're giving to environmental advocates, to clean energy advocates, labor groups, and consumer groups, because they are the stakeholders who can help us deliver that message, and they are also would also benefit from, or I should say, their goals can be furthered by the macro grid. So next slide, please. So this is the macro grid vision statement, and really the reason why I'm here today. I know that Larry talked to you in a previous webinar or meeting about the macro grid vision statement. We see this as the first step in building a coalition that can help us promote this vision of planned regional and interregional transmission. So the vision statement is a high-level statement, and the importance of the vision statement for us is to demonstrate to policymakers and to stakeholders that there is broad, diverse support for this, for interregional and regional transmission investment, expanding and upgrading the grid. So I am here essentially to ask for your help, as we build this coalition. To be clear, affirming support for the vision statement does not imply support for any policy positions, legislation, or specific transmission proposals. So while ASEG and ACOR are engaged in lobbying and regulatory efforts on transmission, the macro grid initiative aims to play a convening role, facilitating discussions that are essential to good policy outcomes. But we will not be lobbying, and we will not be doing any kind of FERC filings, but we will be having conversations that contribute to those discussions. And so the purpose of this vision statement, again, as I said, is to demonstrate wide support for expanding and upgrading the nation's transmission network, and the wider the better. And I hope that you will consider adding your company's names to the list of supporters, and I'll get back to that at the end. But I just wanted you to know that at the outset that is why I'm here, and that is why I'm talking to you. Obviously, having transmission companies is going to be important for making sure that those conversations have the perspectives that they need to have. In other words, you all are the ones who are building transmission. Your views need to be a part of any discussion about how this is going to go forward. Next slide, please. So I do believe that this is possible. Once upon a time, we built a grid that spanned the North American continent. As you know, I'm sure you've heard, this was considered one of the great engineering feats of the 20th century. I put this picture in because, as you know, I did work for NRECA, but also because I think that rural electrification, such an interesting history, and I think there are some lessons in that history that actually can be helpful as we're confronting the challenge that we have today. If you look, it's all there in the picture. It's on that sign, which I just love. Working together, did it, all the power you want at lowest cost, exclamation point. A dream come true at last, at last. I love this sign. So I think if you sort of interpret that as though it were a poem, what you see is that that rural electrification depended on that partnership. It was a public-private partnership with the communities and the Rural Electrification Administration, the REA. I think the other point that this picture makes clear is that there was community buy-in. there was community participation and investment. I think that is so important, and I think that policymakers understand that importance. And again, similarly, you can see that there's a focus on the customer, the consumer. The message is right there. The sign is for the consumers. And rural electrification at its heart was for the electric consumers. I also think that it's important to have a vision, and you know that, and I think when it says a dream come true, what a dream is a vision, and a vision is part of how you can persist in the face of daunting odds, and there are daunting odds. Next slide, please. So, can we do it again? Well, I would also just pose a different question back, which is, can we afford not to? I mean, as I said, I know there's a lot of skepticism. I know this because every time I told somebody what I was going, that I was leaving NRECA to come work for the Macrogrid Initiative and what the goals were, I would frequently they would squint at me and say, well, good luck with that, Tracy. So I know there's some skepticism out there, and certainly, what we're seeing right now in Washington is not, it's not uplifting. Infrastructure week has become a very unfunny punchline, and right now we can't even get a bill passed to help people in the middle of a pandemic and a cataclysmic recession. So, obviously lots of different reasons for that, but I think it is certainly discouraging. But we are going to go out there and we're going to take our message of hope and optimism around transmission to policymakers. And in the next few slides, I want to present our message to Congress, a message that is, as I mentioned, bolstered by research from WIRES. Next slide, please. Well, here is one reason why we cannot afford not to act. The infrastructure, as you all know, is aging. In the webinar recently where WIRE's former director was participating, the American Council of Civil Engineers was presenting on the investment gap, and this fact jumped out at me. A 2015 DOE report found that 70% of transformers and transmission lines are 25 years or older. Okay, so that was 2015. That means, it is now 5 years on. So change that 25 to 30, and then 60% of circuit breakers are 30 years or older. So those are now 35. So I, of course, looked to see what TV shows were popular back then, and I found that it was Golden Girls, which I thought was appropriate. Now, interestingly, when I looked at that, when I was doing that particular bit of research, I did notice that those shows from 30 years ago didn't actually seem that old to me, but that is the difference between TV and electric infrastructure, and it also suggests how old I am. Okay, next slide, please. So again, that was the report from the American Council on Civil Engineers, which is part of a larger project that they're doing on the infrastructure investment gap. This is a chart from that report, and I think what is interesting is that you can see that the transmission portion actually will increase. So I think that there was a significant amount of investment over the last 10 years, but then that gap for the transmission makes up a larger portion of the gap. So funding gaps in electric generation, transmission, and distribution are projected to total 177 billion by 2025, with about 21 billion in that year. A gap in transmission investment makes up a quarter of that total. By 2040, the cumulative gap will reach 565 billion. So again, can we afford not to act? Next slide, please. Now, again, this is something that you all are familiar with. What we're facing now is a constrained grid. The NRDC's Sustainable FERC project put this map up. They have an interactive map with projects in the interconnection queue, and 245 clean energy projects that had reached the advanced stages of the generator interconnection process were withdrawn from the MISO queue, more than 40% of all projects included in the analysis. Now, while projects can be pulled for a range of reasons, one clear contributor is the lack of grid capacity across large swaths of the MISO region. And for developers with proposed projects in these areas, the grid constraints can result in high interconnection costs, forcing them to shelve otherwise economic solar and wind projects. So, I think this is what we're hearing a lot, which is that the ceiling on these solar and wind projects is the transmission system. There was an interesting quote from one of the developers who had to withdraw a 100 megawatt wind farm in southwestern Minnesota after the company was assigned 80 million in network cost upgrades, 8 times higher than expected. He said, ultimately, we had to cancel our power purchase agreement discussions with the customer, and we had to relay to the local community that the benefits they were expecting from this project would not be forthcoming. Again, if you look at this from a policy, from a member of Congress, from a PUC, certainly any PUC member who's elected, that's a tough message that you're not going to get these projects, you're not going to get this development, this economic development, because of the transmission grid. And I think when you look at this map, what you see is lost economic opportunity. And again, as we're in a recession, and that recession, by the way, has hit rural areas harder than the rest of the country, I think this is going to look like a more painful map, to put it that way. So next slide, please. So at the same time that we're rebuilding our aging infrastructure, we need to find a way to connect these wind and solar resources to the population centers, and our demands are changing. So again, this is not going to be news to any of you, of course, but 29 states have set goals for reducing carbon emissions. Several utilities have set very ambitious goals, and some of those utilities are, I think, on the presentation right now. And by 2039, it's estimated that approximately 45.4 gigawatts of solar and 32.5 gigawatts of wind resources are needed to meet these existing renewable portfolio standards. And in fact, the goals of the MISO states, it cannot be met without with the energy that is produced inside MISO. So if those states want to meet those goals, they're going to have to figure out a way to get energy that is produced somewhere outside of MISO. So again, we're dealing with physics, and to meet these goals, something needs to change. Next slide, please. Another important change that we're seeing, and this is from the coming electrification of the North American economy, why we need a robust transmission grid. So this is a WIRE's report. So this chart should look familiar to you. Overall, 70 gigawatts to 200 gigawatts of additional new power generation will be necessary by 2030, to meet the additional electrification related demand, assuming a 75% share of renewable resources and 25% share of natural gas fired resources. So this is, again, I'm not going to go into detail, but it's just one more proof point that that things are changing and that the grid needs to change to handle the what is coming. I do just want to little aside here, I worked on beneficial electrification when I was at NRECA, and back when we started, and I worked with, some of you may know, Keith Dennis. You know, this term was like nobody used this term, and that was just 4 years ago today. It is astonishing to me how fast this concept of electrification has taken off. Now, EPRI is a part of that, but also the environmental groups are a part of that. NRECA was holding statewide meetings on electrification, and they were getting very diverse groups showing up saying, yes, we need to electrify. So there's a huge amount of support for electrification, and that idea has just taken off. Next slide, please. And so again, looking at the investment that's going to be needed to support that, $30 to $90 billion of incremental transmission investments will be necessary in the US by 2030 to meet the changing needs of the system due to electrification, with an additional 200 to 600 billion needed from 2030 to 2050. So that is a significant amount of investment. So, oh, somebody read my mind. Yes. That was the next slide. So this is the context for the macro grid initiative, and you know, we believe that the macro, you know, as we're looking at these challenges, the macro grid answers a number of those challenges. So again, we put in pictures. What we're going to have to do is find a way to build that transmission, and for, you know, I believe that some of that transmission is going to have to be across the seams, and there are huge benefits to doing that. You can reduce power sector emissions by up to 78% compared to 1990 levels, and you can save consumers money. Again, 47. Oh, sorry, there's a mistake on the slide. It's 47 billion annually. So this is, and as I said at the beginning, this is the research that was done by NREL, and when they did the modeling for the macrogrid, they actually did 4 different designs. So I'm talking about the last of those 4 designs, that they found an annual production cost savings to range from 0.8 billion to 2.5 billion over a 15-year period under the current policy case. But then if you add in carbon pricing, it goes from 1.9 billion to 3.8 billion over a 15-year period. So that is consumer benefit, and that's again a very compelling argument. Next slide, please. So now, not everybody is persuaded by modeling. I know this from talking to my family members. So, but if you aren't persuaded by modeling, you can look at the benefits of some of the recent transmission projects. And I think, again, this is going to be very persuasive. You know, you can look at the consumer savings, the environmental benefits, and reliability. And I think we're seeing in California how important reliability is. It's, you know, it recedes into the background when you have a reliable system, but then when things happen, you know, people suddenly understand that it's actually a very important part of the overall system. But again, in making the case for a macrogrid, I think I would just want to focus for a second on the jobs and the economy, because the statistics that come out of these transmission projects that have already happened are, again, to use that word, compelling. When MISO evaluated the impact of its transmission over the 2002 to 2015 period, they had it was a peak of 16,700 to 25,800 total jobs in 2014. And then I'm going to skip down to the bottom. The transmission projects also drove $457 to $765 million of state and local tax revenue and $935 million to $1.5 billion of federal tax revenue. So I think, again, in the context of a recession that is promising to drag on, that kind of local benefit is going to be hugely important. And I also just want to make the case here, which I know many of you know, that if there were this HVDC overlay, there's a lot of AC transmission that would have to be built to again, to tie that into the existing grid. So there is a lot of opportunity. So next slide, please. So that's the case for the macro grid. I want to talk now about the macro grid initiative. I already did go over the goals, that we want. We're looking for an expanded nationwide and eastern grid, and we're focusing on MISO, PJM, and SPP. We're looking at the next round of regional and interregional transmission planning. And we are promoting a fully planned and integrated nationwide transmission system. And I think if you look at our goals, there actually is a lot of common ground between our goals and what I understand WIRE's objectives to be. But I want to use a phrase that Rob Gramlich said to be, which is, to sum it up, what we're pushing for here is a transmission renaissance, a renaissance in regional and interregional transmission. And it's a beautiful vision. Next slide, please. So I looked at the Scott Madden report, and again, I see areas of common ground, and I, don't want to. I want to leave time for questions, so I'm going to not read this entire quote, but I think at the end it says time is of the essence. But basically, that report makes the case that there is a limited time frame, and that we are going to have to expand the grid and upgrade the grid in order to facilitate the changes that are happening, the energy transition that is happening all around us. Next slide, please. Again, in the policy goals section of the Scott Madden report, it calls for a national policy to create a framework for transmission development that would be supported by myriad stakeholders. And as I wanted to highlight that myriad stakeholders. I think that reflects an understanding that there has got to be a coalition and there has to be coordination as we head into these discussions. And then I also, I think this is, it sounds so trite, but education is extremely important. And in my conversations with various congressional staffers, sometimes it feels to me like there's a group that's very, very aware and understands these issues deeply. And then on the other side, there's a very thin, shallow understanding. So that education is necessary. And certainly, what in my vision, I would love to have members of your companies out there helping us doing that education, because I think it is going to be so important, and one organization can't do it. And I think there's certainly a lot of benefit to the practitioners being a part of that education effort. But so anyway, the myriad stakeholders, that is what we've been set up to. That is the purpose of the macro grid initiative. As I said, we're reaching out to clean energy advocates, to utilities, labor organizations, environmental organizations, transmission companies, consumer advocates, And we are asking them to sign on to the vision statement. Next slide, please. This is, a relatively new effort. What our vision is that we're going to have some core members, and they are going to help us reach out to other members. I want to point out that these in this group of vision statement supporters, we have both the Union of Concerned Scientists and Berkshire Hathaway Energy. So again, diversity is going to be the key to the strength of this coalition, and we are working to make that diversity a reality. Next slide, please. So as you all know, these conversations are happening right now. I have been here a very short period of time, but in the very short period of time since I arrived at the initiative, the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis included transmission in its majority report, actually included a lot about transmission, and Kathy Castor, who's the chair of that committee, has used the word supergrid and has said, this is how we are going to meet the ambitious goals that we need to set to deal with climate change. She named transmission first and foremost above other tools. The Senate Democrat Special Committee also put out a report, and that report also included transmission. The unity recommendations of the Sanders and Biden campaigns. I put this in here because I think what's interesting about that is Sanders obviously supporter of the Green New Deal and the Biden campaign, and they both agreed on transmission. So if that in those unity recommendations, transmission was there, and it was included in the infrastructure act, the Moving Forward Act, and in the presidential campaign. Again, I'm just, regardless of where you stand, I think it is notable that transmission is it's a plank in one of the presidential campaigns, and we are, so these conversations are happening, and I also know from people who are attending the fundraisers, and in fact, I got an email from a group that is looking for that is trying to prepare for whatever happens in November. Transmission is just is a part of those conversations. So as my former boss at the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association, Glenn English, used to say, well, you can be at the table or you can be on the menu. And of course, you'd rather be at the table. So, so I wanted that next slide, please. The macro, this brings me back to the vision statement. Signing on as a supporter, as I said, is one way to join these conversations and to get your perspectives heard and hear what others are saying. Again, to be clear, affirming support for the vision statement does not imply any support for policy positions, legislation, or specific transmission proposals. And while ASEG and ACOR are engaged in legislation and regulatory efforts, the Macrogrid Initiative is going to play a convening role. We want to facilitate conversations. Not all of those conversations will be public. Some of those conversations will be private, where we are seeing where organizations stand on these issues. Again, the purpose of the vision statement is to demonstrate broad and diverse support. And the broader and the wider, the better. By signing on to the vision statement, what it would give you opportunities for engagement, again, engagement with groups that you may not ordinarily be engaging with. But we're going to have several options for engagement, including being a part of briefings. We just, the National Electric Manufacturers Association, we're looking at doing a congressional briefing. We're going to do webinars. We're going in and talking to members. We'll be having working groups. But this is an opportunity for you to present your organizations to perspective to key audiences. And also I should mention at press events, and also a way for you to hear what other people are saying. It's a way to stay current on legislative and regulatory developments in transmission policy. Again, we want to open up a conversation, to provide a space for conversation. And we think that these conversations really need to happen. And it's not just about how you get what you want out of policy. It's also about how you would prevent things that you don't want. And I think you all know that very well. So this is where you can talk about what you'd like to see and also what you don't want to see, and explain why. Now, frequently when I present this vision statement, somebody will say, oh, well, it's awfully abstract and a high level and the devil is in the details. Well, we can argue about the details later. In the meantime, this is a no risk proposition, and it is a way to signal that you want to be a part of the discussion about the solutions, about the challenges, about how best to address the challenges, and you want to be a part of what is happening now. That is how I see it. This is the very last slide, second to last slide. I think there are a lot of, despite skepticism, I think there are a lot of reasons for optimism. One is, as I said, the number of reports about the economic impact of transmission development is, that it is obvious that those could be a real benefit during the recession. I think also it's very encouraging that transmission conversations are happening right now. I think the fact that it's a part of the presidential campaign is really encouraging. I think the understanding is starting to get out there that you cannot do this, you cannot meet these goals without a major focus on transmission. I think in the work of the MGI, the Macrogrid Initiative, I think we are seeing that the MISO states have launched a cost allocation work group. So again, people are starting to think about how they're going to tackle the big issues. And there's also now more discussions in the Western and Southeast states regarding the efficacy of markets and RTOs. So I think there's a lot that is happening under the surface, and that in part because our economic circumstances are so dire, people are looking at transmission as a possibility for how we can make some investments that have long-term multiple, as you want to say, stacking benefits. So again, I hope that you all will consider signing on to the vision statement. I'm happy to answer any questions. Just fair warning, I will be following up with some of your organizations individually to talk about this. If you have any questions, please go ahead and you can send them through the chat function.
Well, thanks, Tracy. This was really helpful in terms of giving us a little bit of better understanding about what the Macrogrid Initiative is all about. You definitely give us some things to think about. Of course, as you said, the devil is always in the details, and I think that's something that people will be interested in seeing as things progress with the effort. I did get a couple of questions, though, I'd like to run by you from some of our members. And the first one, is actually focused on technology and how that may play into the development of a macro grid. And it comes from Dave Bryant at CTC Global. And the question is this: it's the Asian Development Bank and other inter-American development banks are funding transmission projects that use high performance conductor technology, not only to support economic development, but also because the technology reduces line losses by 30% or more, and that's helping them to achieve carbon reduction initiatives. So the question is kind of a combination of question and statement: is to what extent can we leverage green bond financing and high performance conductors in the US to do the same thing?
That I would, first of all, let me say, I had a whole section on China and then basically ran out of time. I think it is really interesting to look at what is happening in China, and certainly it's interesting to see that, how they, what they, the emphasis that they're putting and the investment that they're making in these technologies. I can get back to you on that question. I don't have an answer on that now, but I do want to say that part of what I would really like to get at, and I've been starting to ask this question, is what are the technology advances that we should be focusing on? Because I think the Department of Energy is looking at this, and I did have a conversation with them, with a group in the Office of Electricity about those converter stations, and they're looking at the possibility, what can they do to drive down the cost of those large converter stations. But I think there's a whole suite of technologies. And I just want to say, traditionally, the U.S. has been at the forefront of this technology, and and I think we'd all like to stay there. So what are the technologies that we should be focusing on? And I don't know if that's specifically what he's asking about, but I can certainly look into that and get an answer.
Yeah, well, it sounds like ACCC conductor technology might be one of those types of technologies for them to be looking into. And I know in the transmission incentives notice of proposed rulemaking, WIRES supported some of the aspects of that rulemaking with respect to technology incentives, and pointed to that type of technology in particular. So it's certainly worth thinking about as you look at these issues in the initiative going forward.
Yeah,
another question
yep. I would like to do that. Yep. Sorry.
Good. I was going to say another question I had comes from Alex Stern with PSE&G. And his question is that despite the rise of state CO2 emissions goals and the recognition at times by policymakers that transmission is a key component, we keep hearing much more from policymakers about the rising costs of transmission investment. And he's interested in hearing how is the macrogrid initiative looking to ramp up the data surrounding the critical point that transmission investment is likely a critical component to arriving at the least cost grid of the future, while also spurring jobs and driving economic expansion. It's that kind of balance between the costs associated with the investment, but then the benefits and the payoff on the back end.
Yeah, I think a couple of different answers to that. One is we're doing a lot. The macrogrid initiative is doing a lot of research right now, and that's a focus of the research is to look at the economics. And I think, but again, there's already from the transmission investment that happened in MISO. And in SPP, you're starting to build up a record of how that investment is benefiting the local communities and consumers. And I think it'll be important to get that information out there. But again, we have a number of studies that are directly that are looking directly at at that issue. The other, I'm sorry, somebody was slacking me an answer. I think that is going to be important. I think the other thing the other piece of this that's going to be important is re-educating people about economies of scale. Because one of the issues that we're also seeing is that there are a number of organizations and different groups out there that are saying, hey, we can do this all with with DERs and rooftop solar and demand response. And I think it's going to be very important when we're bringing this research together and making the case and creating the infographics that we demonstrate that what the advantage that you get from economies of scale and from a large investment over multiple small investments.
Yeah, and as you're looking at that, I think the Scott Madden report that we put out back in January is helpful on that issue, which is that while DER can certainly be part of the solution, you can't get there with just DER alone. You're going to have transmission as part of the mix, and a significant amount of investment in transmission at that. So,
yeah.
Another question that we have is from Josh Burkhalter. He asked, can you expand on the roles within the nationwide planning framework vision, and how would this interact with the RTO regional and interregional planning processes?
We actually, the macrogrid initiative is working, has an RTO working group. We've segregated the two efforts. So we are working with both SPP and MISO to try to facilitate some progress. As I said, we're also focused on that next round of regional and interregional transmission planning. At the federal level, we are looking at policymakers at the federal level and trying to build awareness and support for some major investments. So I'm not sure that answers the question, and I'd be happy to follow up with more details about about the two different efforts, and also and I can put this together and for your members a review of the research that we're doing.
Okay, great, thanks. Yeah, I forgot to mention Josh is with AEP. And then one question I had was, to what extent do you envision the microgrid initiative looking at some of the obstacles to getting transmission built, and ways to address those? And the one in particular, I think that is of interest to those of us in wires right now is the Order 1000 effort at FERC. And how has that either helped or, I think from our perspective, frankly, more likely impeded the ability to get these larger transmission projects built that you're looking at? And how do we go about revisiting some of those aspects of the order?
Well, the chairman said, I believe it was at your summer board meeting, that the chairman of FERC, Neil Chatterjee, has made it clear he doesn't have an interest in opening up Order 1000. But I do think that there's that there's agreement that, I mean, how can you refute the fact that no interregional transmission projects have been built under Order 1000? So it simply has not lived up to the goals that it was intended for. Again, I think that that both ACOR and ASEG are going to be working together to push for Congress to push FERC for a planning rule. Again, there's just a lot of education that has to happen. I think it was interesting that if you read the FERC report on the opportunities and barriers to high voltage transmission. I read that report as an acknowledgement that Order 1000 has, has a lot of problems. They made it sound like it was somebody else's, issue, but I think that it was interesting that report was an acknowledgement. So we, again, I think that creating a coalition that is broad and that can push for changes will be a key part of how this can happen. And again, making sure that policymakers understand both why it's important to address those barriers will be key.
Thanks. And I see we're starting to get a little late. I've got one more question, and this one comes from Mike Deggendorf of AEP, who's on the WIRE's board of directors. And it kind of goes to your general pitch that you're making, which he says endorsing a macro grid and vision is relatively straightforward. But what preceded in the presentation was a technical solution that seems to go hand in glove. And he says, is the initiative communicating and advocating the solution, or are you trying to advocate a national grid view?
That is of course, a very good question. I'm really glad that you asked that. So the macro grid, there's a distinction between the macro grid as a thing. And, if you look at the NREL research, it's compelling. It's very compelling. At least as far as the modeling goes. But I think that the macro grid is also a way of talking about how are we going to overcome the challenges that are presented by a balkanized grid that is divided up into regions, and how are we going to coordinate national planning, or at least coordinated planning. I don't want to say it's national, but there has to be a way to do more robust planning that can see 10, 20, 30 years out. I think that's one of the issues, one of the problems that we're seeing is that we know what the demands are going to be 30 years out. How do you build transmission now that will be able to meet those future grids? And that was how it was phrased to me by Will Call, who used to be with Bright River Energy. That has to be a planning process. So that's, yes, we are advocating for a macro grid, and if we were China, we would be able to make the investment in a macro grid. And certainly, I think the evidence is there that is that's probably the optimal engineering solution. But I do think at the same time there has to be an effort to address the challenges and the problems that have have prevented us from taking that more coordinated, future-looking approach.
Well, it looks like we're running out of time here, Tracy. I really want to thank you for taking the time to talk to us. You gave us a lot to think over as we continue our own internal discussions about this effort and try and think about what we would like to do going forward, but also I think for our individual members for their own education as to what the effort is all about. So again, thank you for taking the time to share with us today. And if we have any further questions, I think we'll try and follow up with you subsequently offline.
Okay, and I actually will answer those questions that came in and get back to, I can get those answers back to you, Larry, and you can get them to the entire group. That'd be great.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, Tracy. Thanks everyone for joining today's call. I hope you found it helpful. And with that, we'll call it a wrap. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.